Hello again everybody. Today I'm going to begin the first of three talks about emperors from the 3rd century AD. All very different in their own right, and I'm going to start off with Heliogabalus. He wasn't called Heliogabalus when he was born, he was actually called Varius Antoninus, but he called himself later after a sacred stone which came from his native province of Syria. This was a large black stone held to be sacred for reasons we have no idea why, but wherever he went he took it with him, so he called himself after a piece of black stone. He became emperor at the age of 14. Now I just want you to think about that, what you were like when you were 14 and what effect that might have on you if you were in charge of everybody and everything at the age of 14. Well, it didn't go very well for Heliogabalus. He was a very confused teenager altogether. Some modern scholars think that he may have been the first person in history recorded as wanting to change gender. Either way, in the next 4 years he was said to have been married, sort of, perhaps as many as 5 times, sometimes to men, sometimes to women, and he was more than once heard expressing the opinion that he would rather have been a woman than a man. Still, according to the historian, the great historian Edward Gibbon, author of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Heliogabalus was probably the worst emperor of them all. He survived until the grand age of 18, and he was murdered almost certainly on the wishes of his grandmother. So a pretty unusual sort of guy. So I've got a couple of bits of text to share with you to give you some idea of the less unpleasant aspects of his reign. So using the source Aelius Lampridius, one of the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, notoriously unreliable, this is what he said about some of his habits. He would often shut his friends up when they were drunk, and suddenly, in the night, let in lions and leopards and bears, rendered harmless, so that when they woke up they would find at dawn, or what is worse, at night, lions, bears and panthers in the same bedroom as themselves. Several of them died as a result of this. Many of his humbler friends he used to seat on air pillows instead of cushions, and would let out the air while they were dining, so that often the diners were suddenly found under the tables. Finally, he was the first to think of setting out a semicircle on the ground, not on couches, so that the air-conditioned cushions might be loosened by slave boys at their feet to let out the air. It's said that he was the first of the Romans to have worn entirely silk clothing, whereas partly silk garments were already in use. He never touched washed linen, saying that only beggars wore linen clothes that had been washed. Often he was seen in public after dinner wearing a Dalmatian tunic, calling himself Gurges Fabius or Scipio, because he had on the same clothes in which Fabius and Cornelius were brought out in public in their youth by their parents to improve their manners. Now there's all manner of unlikely and unpleasant things that come from that account of him, but this is what happened at his departure. He'd set up a situation where one of his rivals he'd summoned to the court along with some soldiers, along with the Praetorian guards, and the idea was that they'd humiliate this rival and then he'd be killed. However, by the next morning the soldiers had become well fed up with this tirade and things turned nasty. This, by the way, is not official historian, this is from the splendid Imperial Exits. And carries on as follows. Heliogabalus wanted a bloodbath of his opponents, but got one for himself instead. There are 2 versions of his end. In one story, when he realised his plight, he hid in a chest so he could be carried secretly to safety. Hardly a method calculated to allay suspicion, and not surprisingly, he was discovered by the guards and killed at the tender age of 18. In the other version, Heliogabalus went to hide in a toilet, But the soldiers were nothing if not thorough in their rebellion and soon pulled him out and did him in. His mother was done away with at the same time for the sake of tidiness. In a final touching scene, they'd clung to one another as they were slain, and together the bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome, suffering desecration and mutilation on the way. He's had an interesting history since classical times, and he's often been revered as someone to look up to by people of a somewhat decadent outlook. So there have been poems written about him, operas written about him, ballets written about him. He even makes a slightly censored appearance in the Horrible Histories series. What should we make of him? Well, I think more than anything else, we should take from this that you shouldn't give power to teenagers.